welcome to the Iowa Grazing Academy. These are the recordings from the 5 online sessions that were held in July of 2026. If you have any questions, please contact Shelby Gress at the email address listed on the slide. Thank you and enjoy these sessions. Hello and welcome.
So I was invited to talk about fescue management, and this is, I guess, a pretty interesting topic. I would suspect that most people in Iowa deal with the same things that we deal with here in North Central Missouri, and so hopefully I can give you some tips or whatnot to help uh, managing fescue become easier to you or better. So I wanted to start out by just identifying tall fescue, um, and talking about the value of tall fescue to begin with. Um, Really, when I think about tall fescue is the foundation of the beef production in America. Uh, we have around 35 to 40 million acres planted in tall fescue, and it's the primary forage for about 7.2 million beef cows nationwide. And that's not a small number to scoff at it. And really, if you put your pencil to it, you would find that more beef is produced on tall fescue than any other pasture grass, and probably any other grass except for corn, really. And so tall fescue has a lot of value. It's extremely productive. It's very persistent under heavy grazing. It's adapted to our soils and our climate here. It's drought tolerant, it's insect tolerant, it can handle the abuse. Um, it has a long and productive growing season, and it's easy to establish. And that's why sometimes you'll see tall fescue creeping into a lot of places because it has all of the capabilities to adapt and survive the pasture conditions, even if we're not doing a very good job managing our pastures. So, um, when we think about effective tall fescue management, I wanted to point at three key pillars to tall fescue, managing tall fescue. The first being soil fertility. I'm doing a lot of work on soil fertility, so you'll see a lot of that creep into my presentation here. And forage quality is important, both the nutritive aspect and also the end-of-fight mitigation or the anti-quality factors of tall fescue. And then grazing management, what we can do to manage our grazing, give you some ideas there. So, um, so as far as soil fertility goes, tall fescue has a somewhat broad nutrient requirement. The pH range is quite large. Fescue will survive down to a 5.5 or maybe even a 4.5 pH. It really does well between 5.5 and 6.5. And I put up here, I have this slide that talks about the amount of nutrients inside of a bale of fescue hay, or, a round bale of fescue hay. And what you can see here is that every time you remove about 1,200 pounds of tall fescue grass, you're also removing approximately 32 pounds of nitrogen, 12 pounds of phosphorus, and 45 pounds of potassium. And that has a serious value to it. If you look at the dollars, the price per ton on tall fescue, and these are prices from last year. Of course, the prices are higher now. But if you look at the value per ton and just the nutrients on a fertilizer scale, you're looking at about $72 plus, just for the nutrients. And on the right-hand side of your screen here, you'll see that I have uh, put phosphorus and potassium and compared them to the digestibility of the forage. And what you'll find is when we have higher quality forages, they will also be higher in concentrations of phosphorus and potassium. And that tells us that if we're looking for something that is higher quality, those higher quality that higher quality forage needs good levels of phosphorus and potassium to maintain that quality. Um, so let's look at the yield response. If we're looking at nitrogen, and nitrogen is really, when we're looking at all of the nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium mainly. Phosphorus and potassium are very simple to manage. Run the soil test and see what the quality or what the soil test says and fertilize to that point. And that pretty much works. And it's usually you receive a pretty decent response from applying those two nutrients. Um, if we look at um, the yield response of nitrogen tall fescue, um, you'll see that after about 120 pounds of nitrogen, we're kind of tapering off or plateauing as far as yield response. And but the most interesting thing when we look at our yield response of tall fescue to nitrogen is that we can double our forage production by applying up to 120 pounds of nitrogen. The question is this actually a good thing to do? And that's what I'm going to work on answering next for you. This is a chart basically estimating the variability of each of the treatments or each of the nitrogen rates compared to that 120 pound rate. And what you'll want to see when you look at this chart is the ones that are up and to the left, or the points that are up and to the left have greater returns and less risk. The ones that are down and to the right have less returns and more risk. And so you can see that higher nitrogen rates actually are more risky, or you end up with a more variable response the greater the nitrogen rate goes. And these moderate nitrogen rates are less risky and even more profitable, all the way down to zero. Um, if we look at this data in a different way, and what I did here is I took the cost of nitrogen, right, the price in dollars per pound for a pound of nitrogen, and and I just did a few different rays as far as rate response goes. So this chart is telling us what the returns after the fertilizer expense are. And you can see that our returns after the fertilizer expense, they plateau around 60 pounds and then they start going downhill, which means that really after 60 pounds, we're not getting a very efficient use out of our nitrogen for tall fescue. And so it's interesting to see that even though at 120 pounds we can double our production, 120 pounds of nitrogen is less economically viable than 0 pounds of nitrogen. So it's it's interesting to look at all of this and say, okay, well, we can double our yield, but even in doubling our yield, it won't make us any more money. Another thing about nitrogen fertilizer is that it also reduces legumes. This is a publication that was done in 2017, and there's a lot of data behind this. But it goes to show as we increase our nitrogen rates, our legume populations go down dramatically. Um, and with a nitrogen rate of zero or no nitrogen applied, that's where we see our greatest legume populations. And so if we want to get other species in with our in with our tall fescue grass, it's really important that we avoid using nitrogen fertilizer. So let's look at the relationship between digestibility and crude protein. And this chart has crude protein on the x-axis and in vitro dry matter digestibility or IVT-DMD on the y-axis. And you'll find as the quality goes up, either in crude protein or in vitro dry matter digestibility, both of the quality factors are increased. And the question is, why is this happening? And really, the answer comes down to this is happening because these two are kind of tied together as far as the maturity of the grass goes. So let's look at this in a different lens also. When we apply our fertilizer in a tall fescue pasture, that is also going to increase our uh, our nutritive value, essentially. Our total digestible nutrients and our crude protein both increase as we increase the nitrogen rate. Um, but another concern that we have is that as we increase our nitrogen rates, as you can see in this table, as we increase our nitrogen rates, our ergovaline content goes way up. And you'll see in all of the areas inside the plant, both the seed heads, the stems, and the leaves. If we increase our nitrogen rate, our ergovaline content increases. So that's something to watch out for because because even if it is higher quality, if it has that ergovaline in it, we're actually making that an anti-quality factor, which makes lower animal performance and not better animal performance. Um, all of this being said, total digestible nutrients or TDN is usually when we're in a pasture setting, TDN is usually the limiting factor. A lot of people talk about crude protein, but when we're in a pasture, we're really concerned about the TDN or the energy. Um, I mean, there are very few times where I have sampled a pasture and found that the crude protein is insufficient. Usually it is. But it is often to sample a pasture and find that the TDN is not where it needs to be. And so that's something that we need to manage for. Um, and so all of these charts go to show, yeah, we can increase the pounds of TDN with nitrogen. But compared to just purchasing some hay that has, maybe 52% TDN in it, what, you know, it's a better buy than spending the money on nitrogen, which is actually quite interesting. Um, and purchasing hay is a guarantee, whereas applying the nitrogen may not be. So let's talk about harvest a little bit. And this goes for It goes for hay, it goes for grazing, it goes for everything. The number one predictor of yield is maturity. So as the plant grows, it produces more yield. And the number one predictor of quality is also maturity. So as the plant grows, the quality goes down. Our job as grazing managers is to find that point where we are getting uh, as much as we can the best of both worlds, where we're getting decent quality and acceptable yields all at the same time. And that's why rotational stocking is so important because if we are always staying on either side of this graph, then one of our needs are not being met. If we're in an if we're in a pasture where we're constantly grazing or overgrazing, we will typically end up with with a scenario where our yields aren't very good, but our quality is okay. So, the downfall there is that your animals will probably um, if your stocking rates are correct, your animals will probably perform pretty well, but you won't get a whole lot of yield out of it, and so you won't be able to stock as heavy as you could. And that's important because the more animals we can have on the land, the more money we can make. So it's important to keep that in mind as you're planning your rotations. Another important thing, as far as forage quality, if we're talking about the endophytes, is by planting improved varieties. If you have a pasture that maybe it was a soybean field recently, or you're replanting or something like that, I would recommend to look at a endophyte free or a novel endophyte tall fescue variety. The recent variety testing that has been done is showing us that um, that these new varieties of endophyte free and novel endophyte tall fescue are actually persisting really well, and they're producing as much or more biomass as what Kentucky 31 would. And so it makes a lot of sense if you're going into a pasture and you're going to make a renovation anyways, or you're planting a new pasture, to go ahead and seed it to one of these varieties, because that will eliminate a lot of your issues with endophyte infected tall fescue or fescue toxicity. Let's talk a little bit about fescue growth and stocking for a minute. As was already mentioned, fescue grows really quickly in the spring, and it also has quite a bit of growth in the fall, but not so much during the summer. And that is because fescue has an optimal growth temperature of between 60 and 75 degrees. That's when it grows the fastest. When the temperatures get above 85 to 90 degrees, that's where we start to classify it as a summer slump, and grasses grow pretty slowly during that time. And um, and then, really active growth will continue for a tall fescue down until the soil hits about 50 degrees soil temperature in the fall. So we get a lot of really good growth, and compared to other cool season grasses, tall fescue grows a lot more during the summer and during the fall time than pretty much any other cool season grass. And that's important. That's one of the values of tall fescue, is that it can really produce during the summer and fall time. And those are times when we almost need to forage more than in the springtime, because usually we have too much forage in the springtime and not so much during the summer and fall. So where does the pasture health fail, and what leads to um, what leads to our pastures looking bad or not performing very well? And what I'll say here is that rain makes everybody look good. But my question to you is, what do your tall fescue pastures look like when it's dry? And we can point this back to how are you managing your grass? So I have this cycle over here, and I call it a vicious cycle because it is quite vicious. If we graze or cut our tall fescue, then it will begin to regrow. And depending on how much we took off, it will use some of those root reserves to regrow. And then we must give it some adequate rest before grazing or cutting it again. Um, and that will allow the plant to regrow, to allow the roots to regrow, so that we have something good to graze off again. What happens, what the issue here is that if we graze or cut this, and then it starts to regrow, and then if we're in a drought and it's regrowing slowly, then we have this temptation. Okay, we've finished our rotation. We've gone through all our paddocks and we've gotten back to the beginning, and our grass just really hasn't regrown yet. Our temptation is, okay, well, there's still grass there, and there may be just as much grass as we had before. And so the temptation is, okay, well, let's just graze it again. There's still not, we still didn't have any regrowth, but there's something there to graze. And that's not a good idea because when we graze or cut it again, it hasn't regrown, the root reserves haven't regrown, and um, and it just depletes the root mass and it depletes the plant's capability of producing more or being more productive. And so what we end up with is this really short plant on the top side and a really short root system on the bottom side. And that's a problem because that plant is not very drought resilient. And because the root structure isn't very large, and so it can't access water, it doesn't have enough solar panel essentially, or um, plant leaf blade material to adequately photosynthesize so it can grow aggressively. And so when we do this, when we decide to graze or cut before we're rested, we end up in a perpetually worse situation. This would be one of the many reasons why we see pastures kind of lag or grow slowly after we've experienced a drought, especially a drought in the fall. Um, another thing that we should look at is what our defoliation has to do with root growth, because this root growth is very important to plant health and plant growth. So there have been a number of studies done on this, and if we look at this table on the left, you'll see that the percentage of top growth removed and and the root growth that is stopped by removing that amount. So we can remove up to 40% without really affecting the plant at all. The roots will grow normally, the plant will grow normally. At 50%, maybe a marginal reduction in root growth. And when we get up to 80% utilization or 80% of that top growth removed, we have completely stopped those roots from growing, and basically we've pretty well shut down the plant, and it takes that plant longer to get back to that full growth pattern again. On the right hand side of this slide is the rest and recovery situation for tall fescue. Think about this. Let's think about this as if we're mowing a lawn versus a well-managed tall fescue pasture. So this red bar right here, this is the forage production when we cut tall fescue frequently. This would be a once a week or maybe almost daily, depending on the type of the year. But this research, every time that one leaf was produced, they went ahead and cut the leaf. Um, and then as we go up, if we look at the green bar, and we have a long and adequate re growth and recovery time period. This research cut the plants at the four leaf stage, and by doing so, they nearly doubled the forage production. And that is really important because that is telling us, if we are in a situation where we're uh, doing a continuous stocking system where the animals just go out in the field and they graze and they regraze the plants and they're really almost grazing some of the tall fescue plants every day, we get less production. If we give them the adequate rest that they need, get them to that four leaf stage or greater, then we will see our yield almost double. And that means that our stocking rate can double as well, um, at least theoretically. Another thing, just real quickly before I wrap up here, is fescue toxicity, because fescue toxicity can also be managed by our grazing. Notice here that the stems and the leaves have the highest concentrations of toxicity. Um, if if we force the animals to eat the stems, especially the lower portions of the stems and the seed heads, parts that they really don't prefer to eat, then we'll have more fescue toxicity issues. Um, but there's some things and here to talk about as well is, if we're managing a fescue pasture, we really don't want it to be a pure stand of tall fescue. It's really important to have some other things in there for the animals to eat as well, because some of the other species can also reduce our endophyte toxicity or fescue toxicosis. One of the best ones is red clover. And red clover has these phytoestrogens called isoflavones, and they directly counteract fescue toxicosis by increasing the blood flow, and that gives them better heat and cold tolerance and improves their average daily gain, as you can see in this graph on the right. And so a lot of a lot of good things can be done if you're managing your pastures correctly, and if you are grazing them correctly, you can have a lot of success with tall fescue. It's really not a bad plant to have around if you're managing it correctly.